Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week's Torah portion is called Korach, and it covers in the book of Numbers, chapters 16, 17, and 18. And Korach's story is difficult to follow. Korach is a person. He is a member of the Levites, and he seems to be the head of a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And it's a little confusing what they are rebelling against. Are they rebelling against Moses' leadership because they resent that he is a leader and they happen to be descendants of the firstborn son of Jacob, Reuben. And so they feel that they deserve to be the leaders much more than Moses in the civil sense, as we would say it today, and Aaron in the religious sense. But it also seems to be a rebellion against Aaron's authority as a priest as well, because they are Levites and yet they are not high priests. So there seems to be quite a bit of resentment and jealousy on two levels. And that's one of the reasons why this week's portion really has a good sense for us of why the documentary hypothesis came into being in the 19th century. And toward the end of the portion in chapter 18, we see what today we call emoluments, benefits, perks that the priests get that come from the system of tithes, or as today we would look at it in terms of money and taxes, but tithes are contributions of produce. And they seem to focus on the priests and what the priests get in return for setting themselves apart as God's servants, God's representatives in the priestly service. And there doesn't seem to be a mention of taxes in the sense that we would understand it, supporting the rest of the community. And we will find in Deuteronomy a parallel set of mitzvot, of commandments, that show us that the system of tithing is meant to support the poor, to ensure the viability and health of the community as a whole. So it's a little hard to follow. And in fact, there is a whole sort of stream or genre within Torah commentary that tries to reconcile these seemingly inconsistent or incomplete sections of the Torah where we don't quite understand what is happening, or we see things that are inconsistent or illogical. And of course, until about the 19th century, most people assumed that the Torah was a single work written by a single hand, that is to say, God, and given to Moses, and that this unity of these five books is key to understanding and to following the instructions of the Torah, and really key to being part of our covenant with God. And in the 12th century, late 11th and into the 12th century, there was a scholar named Rashi. Rashi itself is an acronym, Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, and he lived in what today is Eastern France. And he was the greatest scholar of his time. He learned from a group of scholars in the city of Worms, a community that was wiped out in the pogroms of the First Crusade. And Rashi taught, and this became the benchmark for beginning Torah study. Rashi taught that there is nothing illogical, inconsistent, redundant, or unnecessary in the Torah. And all of his commentary looks at places where things are not quite so clear and tries to reconcile the inconsistencies, the illogic, the repetition. And so it was until the 18th century. I'm sorry, late 18th century and into the 19th century. And modern scholars uh, began to look at these inconsistencies and see patterns. And from the patterns, they deduced that, in fact, the Torah text as we have it is a composite uh, put together by uh, a number of schools of thought and commentary at different times. And those schools are based on characteristics of these major themes, and there are four of them. Uh, E for Elohim, the use of Elohim in the Torah. J for Adonai, which in Hebrew is Yud He Vav He, and the Yud gets transposed into a J when it's transliterated into Greek and then Latin. Uh, and the P, the priestly code, and D, the Deuteronomy code, and that they were all woven together by a redactor, kind of an editor's editor. And this really gave us a lot of insight into how the Torah is constructed and how the stories were edited together from many traditions, many oral and written traditions, to become what we know of today as the Torah. And the single text that we have was really finalized, given its pronunciation and its chanting, by a school of scholars called the Masoretes about 1,000 years ago. So this is a very long-term and dynamic process, it going back to the days of the first temple. We see that in the story of Korach and his rebellion, that it looks like the rebellion against Moses for his civic leadership, the resentment of his authority, and the jealousy over Aaron as priest rather than the firstborn son's descendants, the tribe of Reuben, become woven together into a single story, a single narrative, because the leadership of Aaron and Moses comes not from their innate abilities or from their ambitions, certainly not from their ambitions, but because God chose them. And in challenging their authority, Korach and his followers are challenging God. And this portion comes to us from the priestly code, which holds that the priests are designated by God for service, that they are to be followed, to be obeyed, because they have God behind them, that God chose them, God designated, and that the things that they get, the tithing to support them, are in lieu of owning land and also to compensate, to support them, because they really are in a very risky position because they come so close to God, to the holy, in performing sacrifices and maintaining the temple, and before the temple, maintaining the tabernacle in the wilderness. This is a very spiritually dangerous place to be because you are so close to the holy and you must maintain your purity and your discipline. And so they get a portion of tithes to support them, to take care of them for all that they do. We find similar laws in the book of Deuteronomy that relate to tithing as a support for the poor. And the poor are not really mentioned in Numbers. This is concerned with the behavior, the responsibilities, the duties, and the compensation for the priests. So it's not that the book of Numbers doesn't care about the poor, it's just not the topic at the time. And each one, the priestly code that we see in Numbers, and as we'll see later in about chapter 18 in Deuteronomy, the concern with society as a whole, um, concern not just physical sustenance, but spiritual sustenance as well. So, this editing process, what we now call critical scholarship, is a product of the 19th century, but it gives us a whole new layer of insight into how to read the Torah, how to understand what the Torah means, what it means for us, and to how to have perspective on the different stories, the narratives, and of course the mitzvot in the Torah. So far from disturbing and undermining the unity of the Torah itself, it gives us another way to understand, another way to see the dynamics of the ancient societies, plural, the society of the wilderness, the society of the time of conquest, the society of the first temple under the priests, how these societies emphasize their values and how they work, how these systems are intended to work in their own time. So if you are confused, if you find this a difficult portion, you are not alone. And in fact, some will say that if you are not confused, you have not been paying attention. So follow the story. And yes, there are themes about jealousy and resentment and authority that are certainly present in human society in any time and place. And for that, we can be grateful that the Torah shows us that these aspects of human nature are indeed universal and timeless. So I wish you a good Shabbat, a Shabbat of questioning, of probing, of study, of engaging with the Torah and learning from it, of listening to it and letting it speak to you, and having your own conversations with our holiest of texts. I wish you peace. I wish you joy and health this Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.